Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Uwe Brandis. I'm the Executive Director of the Urban and Regional Planning Program here at Georgetown. And it's very exciting to be having this session here this evening. And right off the bat, I want to express my thanks to Nancy Susky. This is a joint program tonight between our program and the Emergency and Disaster Management Program. This is also part of a series of dialogues that we've been hosting this spring that we've entitled The City Disrupted. And we spent the fall semester in a similar public speaking series focused on long-term investments in cities that often take 20, 30, sometimes 40 years to implement. And we're turning now to the flip side of the equation, looking at specific things happening in cities, happening in a very contemporary way, that are really forcing decisions that might not typically be part of a long-range planning process. And we're very excited to be having this conversation tonight that we've described as risk as opportunity, resilience and preparedness as the basis of long-term planning. And we have an all-star lineup of speakers joining us tonight. And I also wanted to note that all of these speakers are involved in our programs as faculty. So we're especially proud of the panel here this evening. Very quickly, we're going to hear from Randy Griffin. Randy is the owner and principal consultant for safety analytics, station captain with the DeWitt Fire District, and the visiting assistant professor of practice in the EDM program. David Kaufman is the vice president and director of CNA Safety and Security Center. Trisha Miller is the senior advisor in the Office of Economic Resilience at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And Josh Murphy is here with us. He's a senior spatial analyst at the Coastal Services Center, which is part of NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. All of these people are incredibly accomplished in many, many different things. But most importantly, I think for tonight, they're each shaping this discussion in real time. And it's really a pleasure to have you here this evening. And before we start with the panel, I would just want to ask Nancy to come up and make a few remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Uwe. So welcome, everyone. I thought I'd just say a few words. I think many of you here are familiar with the Urban and Regional Planning Program, but maybe not so much with Emergency and Disaster Management. It's a one-year master's degree program. It's one of the first hybrid programs here at SES, online and on-site. So we look at the theory and the history of emergency management and then get out there in the field and see how it really works. And my interest in this panel and having our folks participate in this particular event is that I think it's really important to understand that community resilience can be built in at the planning stage and at the building stage of an urban environment, but it's also very dependent on personal resilience. And so for the folks that are working in our profession, the more resilient we can make communities and the more resilient we can make the individuals who live in communities, the better prepared we'll be and the better we'll be able to respond and recover when unexpected things happen. So I would invite you to treat this as a conversation. Please don't hold back your questions or comments, and I'm sure the panel will be happy to engage. Thanks.
Thanks, Nancy. So let's start with just a very simple first round. If you could just introduce yourself and importantly, talk a little bit about what you do, what maybe keeps you up at night, and how this issue of risk plays into your professional activities. So we'll start with you, Josh.
Thanks, Uwe and Nancy, and good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see so many familiar faces. So again, my name is Josh Murphy. I'm with NOAA's now, we call ourselves the Office for Coastal Management. within NOAA's National Ocean Service. NOAA, again, stands for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. A lot of us folks know us for the National Weather Service, but we do a lot of other work as a federal science agency. Our organization works a lot with coastal communities, so no matter how you define the coast, whether you kind of think about just the coastline itself or the adjacent upland watersheds, our coastal area comprises only a small portion of the U.S. with regard to land area, but we have a majority of the population that resides there in the coastal zone. And if you don't live in the coastal zone, odds are you recreate there, you visit there. You know, a lot of us go there to the beach, and predominance of our cities are based in the coastal zone. And so these are areas that are predominantly at risk based on their location. They're low-lying. So this idea of resilience really resonates in our coastal communities. And so my office, my organization, we work with both the coastal communities themselves as well as a lot of different organizations at the federal, state, local, and NGO level to provide decision makers, those who are, whether they're planners, whether they're emergency managers, whether they're the city leaders, who are tasked with better understanding their risks, not only that they are facing today, but also figuring out how we can arm them with information that allows them to look at future conditions and things like climate change, which is a big game changer as it relates to resilience. And then, specifically my organization and a lot of what I am involved with is developing place-based data tools and other information resources vis-a-vis geographic information systems and mapping that really are flexible enough to really relate to the unique risks that each individual city faces. And I think that's a big challenge for all of us as we figure out how we as federal organizations at the federal level can help to enable communities to be more resilient. Is that each city is unique. Each city has unique socioeconomic constraints and factors and strengths and weaknesses that mean that we can't have broad brush approaches that really work well all across the country and at the community level. So look forward to hearing from you guys on the panel today about maybe what your thoughts are with resilience and engaging the others with the conversation.
Great, thanks.
And again, thank you, Uva and Nancy, for inviting me to be part of this and to be a part of such an esteemed panel. My background is a little bit different. I come from the fire service, spent 25 years in the career fire service. So we did resilience before the word resilience was really a catchphrase. I also teach not only here at Georgetown University, but also at Syracuse University. And so I have kind of both angles. I spent 6 years with the Department of Homeland Security when it was first stood up, so from a policy level, but also a boots on the ground level, and trying to build that adaptive capability at the local level. And again, I think to Nancy's point, for me, resilience at the tip of it is about building those relationships and getting people to understand why they need to have those relationships to build that resource robustness that we need after a crisis occurs. So that's mainly where I focus as at a local level of trying to help facilities and individuals as well become better prepared.
Thanks. And it's great to see some of my former students in the audience tonight. I look forward to catching up with many of you. I have the pleasure of being an adjunct professor under Uva's program and working with many colleagues here around policy issues that focus on the intersection of climate change, community resilience, and energy policies. And so the perspective that I bring as a former practitioner and lawyer working on the front lines of community development in the aftermath of Katrina down in coastal Mississippi to today being part of the federal government is really seeing that continuum of how communities respond, how individuals respond, and what are the policy levers that we have and the tools, like Josh mentioned, that NOAA and other agencies have created to help us really plan for long-term disaster recovery and resilience. And from HUD's perspective, you don't often think of the housing agency as a center for resilience planning. Our office, where I sit, was recently renamed the Office of Economic Resilience, with an intentional pivot to focus on these issues of place-based strategies that focus on long-term economic recovery and resilience planning. And two examples I wanted to share, and we'll be happy to take questions about later, are efforts in the aftermath of Sandy, where our former HUD Secretary Sean Donovan was tasked with standing up the Hurricane Sandy task force. And a part of that effort was to work across the federal family to be able to respond immediately to help families get back into their homes, following FEMA's lead on the emergency disaster response, and then looking at long-term planning so that we were utilizing our dollars to help communities not only recover but build back stronger with smarter policies and tools that could integrate infrastructure and housing, so that we weren't just pouring in billions of investment dollars into the same style of planning in flood-prone risk areas that we had been doing under previous storm events. And just to put in perspective, HUD's budget for recovery efforts since 2005, HUD received $40 billion by Congress to deal with natural disasters. That's the equivalent of HUD's annual budget. So it's a lot of money in times of crisis that we handle as an agency. And what's interesting after Sandy was we tried to pivot to how do we utilize those dollars instead of dealing with immediate disaster recovery needs to helping communities utilize those funds for infrastructure and housing investments that are going to respond to resilience and disaster preparedness. So two examples. One is after Sandy, we stood up the Rebuild by Design competition to bring hopefully some of you in the audience and your peers together with architects and planners and engineers to come up with the best design proposals to integrate long-term community resilience designs into the storm-affected region from Sandy. And then we took some of the lessons that came out of that design competition and have applied it to the National Disaster Resilience Competition, which we have $1 billion right now that's the applications are due next week, and are utilizing those funds to have a similar focus on supporting states, local governments, and tribal housing leaders and communities invest in their long-term resilience plans. So we see that as the long road towards risk-based planning and resilience strategies moving forward.
Afternoon, evening, whatever time it is. I'm Dave Kaufman. I spent the last 5.5 years at FEMA as the Associate Administrator for Policy, where I had a hand in setting out the agency's direction and our emphasis on community-based approaches to disaster management, and also an effort looking at sort of the larger global trends that are happening in the ways our operating environment is changing. About 2.5 weeks ago, I joined CNA, which is a nonprofit research organization in Arlington. I lead our safety and security practice, including our work in energy and the environment, public health, emergency management, et cetera. You asked what keeps us up at night. So I think we live in a fascinating time, and I'm going to give you sort of an abstracted answer to that question and then a specific. Virtually nothing about the way our communities work and our society lives and breathes every day is static. The way information is used in our lives has changed radically, doesn't begin to describe it in the last 10 years. And what that in turn drives in terms of globalization and just-in-time delivery models, digital demand signals. The days in which inventory was predicted and pushed are gone. Everything is a digital pull from a scan once you buy a product. And the first thing that happens in a disaster is those signals go dark, right? So the supply chain starts automatically rerouting commodities elsewhere, away from where they're now needed most. I mean, you've got all sorts of impacts that cascade from that. Our demographics are changing, right? At the start of the Obama administration. No coincidence, no relation, just timing-wise, was around the time that, for the first time in human history, more people lived in urban centers than in rural areas across the globe. And that trend continues to intensify. And as Sandy points out very clearly, disasters in dense urban settings are quite different than in rural areas and bring different operational challenges. The climate is changing, the risks that we face. The historical record is no longer an accurate predictor of future occurrence in and of itself. It's shifting. You start stacking these things on top of each other. Population moving to coastal areas, moving to urban areas where risks profiles are changing, leveraging infrastructure that's generally already operating beyond its design specs and already under significant stress. You start to paint a picture where there is a lot more fragility in strange places baked into the system. I like to think about risk sort of like water. This might have to do with certain problems I've had in my home. You can draw your own conclusions. But those of you who have had leaks in your home know that water shows up in weird places. And those places don't usually have any relationship to where the leak actually is. And it can take a lot of effort to figure out where that is. So if you think about the system writ large, I think risk pools in the system. But it's not visible. It's an invisible pooling. And more we see evidence of that in surprising ways. And usually those are second and third order effects. The triple disaster in Japan shutting down truck production in Louisiana, as an example. And those are no longer, it's not a question of enough analytic capability and modeling to predict it. More often they're inherently unpredictable. And so that puts an increasing premium on our ability to be agile, adaptive, and responsive in how we both assess and understand risk, how we cope directly with uncertainty. And remember, most of the time, risk assessment is used to push uncertainty out, to crowd out uncertainty, not to bring it into the central part of the decision process. And so those are real challenges to how we plan in our communities, how we ensure the vitality of our communities and our society, all the way to the operational sides of how we deal with major crises when they come. And the hardest part of all of that, how we recover. So that's what keeps me up at night.
So the only thing I guess that I might be able to add, if it's even an add, before I came to Georgetown, I continue to work actually at Lawrence Livermore National Lab. I'm a mechanical engineer by training. So I focused a lot on the science and technology. And the kinds of problems that we're facing today, as Dave described so beautifully, is something that is going to take a huge investment in science and engineering to mitigate and to learn how to live with. Climate change and the impact of climate change is probably what keeps me awake most at night. I live in California, and those of you who have been reading the paper about our water situation out in California, we are not ready as a community or as individuals in that community. So I think this is a very timely panel.
Before we go to the audience, and I want to go to the audience very quickly here, so start thinking about questions. I do want to do just another quick round, though, and acknowledge that a lot of people's understanding around, especially around crises, is through the media. And so we all have often very vivid pictures of what crisis means to communities. But in light of that, could you give an example, just a tangible example of where you think professional practices are changing around crisis and community planning? So, and there are of course many, but I want to just seed the conversation with the audience a little bit more around, kind of concrete changes and innovations in professional practice. And I just also want to just quickly acknowledge that we do of course have a federally biased conversation here. In how does that change how you work with communities and kind of looking at it from the kind of community perspective?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think what we've seen is that we do need to be looking, obviously, at the intersections with science and the intersections with engineering and the like, but I think what we can't lose sight of is the kind of social dimension and the social science kind of dimensions of these, and especially when we're thinking about the community writ large. Trisha earlier spoke about the Rebuild by Design competition that we saw after Sandy. These crises and events can be enormous challenges, but they can also provide great opportunities. And I think that one of the things that we saw that we felt very favorably upon with Rebuild by Design was that it was this great nexus point of design, of engineering, but also there was a huge aspect of kind of risk communication at the community level, and recognizing that in these communities, and especially in these large urban areas like New York, especially, you've got these very tight-knit neighborhoods that have these very intact, very resilient communication structures. And there's a lot that we can learn ourselves in the policies that we developed and how we enact them that recognize that as we kind of identify risks and we develop strategies to respond, that we should be very aware and cognizant of these social structures and the fact that we have to think about the people portion of the community too. We can engineer a building to be very resilient to weather and climate, but if we can't get the people who work in that to the building itself, then we really aren't making that building very resilient.
I would agree everything that Josh said. Getting back to how is it different, I think with the level of transparency that we have today is probably the biggest, and the quick reaction to try to beat Twitter with the story. And I think probably the one that jumps to my mind when you first asked the question as far as what has been a positive outcome is, to me, we were just recently in New Orleans not too long ago talking about natural disasters and the Dutch dialogues that are occurring in New Orleans, an adaptation. Instead of trying to resist the water, how can we adapt? Have communities, and again, that's not just a New Orleans issue, that's any metropolitan area in the United States. How we work with water and how do we adapt to surge is important.
I think building off of that, it's also shifting the way we think about the profession as planners, architects, and engineers. We are all working now within that frame of reference that this is about, resilience and planning for anticipating how and adapting to climate change, which is a lot different than when I was in school. So I think, as I bring the federal lens from HUD and some of the lessons we learned from the Rebuild by Design competition, but it's the intersection of the human capital and a different way of encountering policy and physical infrastructure choices that we have to make at the community level, which is really where we see this nexus. And I think we have the blunt instruments at the federal level to try and reshape or reframe the conversation and invest in communities that are already thinking about the next storm or the changing patterns of coastal areas, and it's only going to happen if we invest on the human capital side and really foster those partnerships from the federal, state, and local levels.
So I think we are in the middle of a real shift in how disaster services are delivered. And I'll give you 3 examples of things that just couldn't have happened even 5 or 10 years ago, 10 years ago. During the Haiti earthquake, you had a Haitian diaspora self-organize generally around Atlanta and begin translating and plotting texts received in Creole from survivors trapped in the rubble. And they ended up plotting over 80,000 texts in what became a live crisis map that was credited by responders with saving hundreds of lives. That is technology democratizing public space in a way that led to the literal saving of lives from people that previously would have had no way of communicating their location and much less hope of being saved. During Hurricane Sandy, a group of high school students in New Jersey created a crisis map depicting gas station status and availability in the Northeast. And that gave rise to what became a Google crisis map, which is the information we use to brief the president, because, believe it or not, no one knows where all the gas stations are, let alone whether they're open or not. And so again, you know, crowdsourcing situational awareness on a really critical thing. Wholly different, equally powerful and in a very different way. The Occupy Wall Street movement pivoted, became Occupy Sandy, and set up Amazon.com wedding registries to target specific commodities that were needed in specific neighborhoods or even streets, and funnel the delivery of those support services through, you know, a means that we all use on a regular basis to buy gifts for people. And since then, Amazon has been working with them to retool how their systems are used so that that capability can be employed again in future disasters. I mean, I think we are witnessing real changes that drive home the fact that disasters don't happen to governments, they happen to society, and that all segments of society not only have something to bring to bear, but are actively engaged in doing that. I think that's both great and really exciting.
We have our first question here. I would just ask that the panelists speak up and project. It's hard to hear. And please introduce yourself.
Thanks. My name's Adam. I'm a current student at the EDM program. One of the things that I've been thinking about of late is there's this decoupling of risk and consequence. So when we kind of subsidize the flood insurance program, or we allow people to rebuild in certain areas without feeling that real consequence in their wallet or whatever. I mean, of course, we have that humanitarian urge to, oh, okay, your house is destroyed. Let's help. We're all in this business because we want to help people. But from a policy perspective, are there steps we can take to kind of reconnect that risk and consequence, whether it's through HUD influencing county building codes or zoning regulations, through whatever financial instruments you have, or FEMA adjusting the flood maps? There's a whole host of options that we can do. And when we're talking about kind of reacting to emerging trends, whether it's, you know, whatever may have caused these things, migrations to the coastal areas, concentration of population in urban areas, how do we reconnect that risk to that consequence? And then again, how do we balance that with our natural inclination to help? Thanks.
And I'm going to ask Trisha to respond to this, because I also saw this week in the New York Times that the state of New York is now going to sell properties to into the marketplace again that they had actually acquired in order to keep them from being developed in post-Sandy. So.
First, I think on the codes side, that's a great. The point you raised about, you know, how do we tie, I think, and where we set some minimum standards that have real consequences for the recipients of federal dollars. Resilient and energy efficient codes is one way to do it. We think of codes as largely a state and local function, but there's also certain requirements for our housing programs where we can tie directly those dollars, whether they're going through block grants to states and municipalities, or directly tied into financing new affordable housing assets. There's an opportunity, and you know, very much in our office we see a mandate to make sure that any new investments in housing and infrastructure come with certain requirements that those not only the location of those new investments, but the built environment is responsive to climate change and it meets certain energy efficiency goals. So that's one clear pathway where we have started by just raising the bar on minimum threshold energy requirements for new housing construction that's financed directly or indirectly by HUD. I think the next question is, how do we go beyond energy efficiency and look at other standards that tie in more comprehensively to resilience, and that's about location. It's also about, you know, the building materials and how sites can serve multiple purposes, to build some redundancy into the system so that we can accommodate flood events and I think we're just getting started to look beyond energy efficiency, but there's a huge opportunity there to make policies right-sized for the kind of investments that would support resilience. I'm not going to speak to the state's buyout program. I'm not the best person to address that, Uwe, but I think it is an interesting example in real time where it's an optional. How do you reconstruct communities to move housing in or away from the most flood-prone areas? And if you have incentive-based approaches and regulatory tools that we talk about in my land use class. I think that you see the consequences of different styles of policy that's all driven towards reshaping the physical environment to create some physical barriers that make a lot of sense. It's just a question of how do you do that and still protect the housing assets and ownership that comes behind it.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Dan Mooring. I'm Dan Mooring, recent graduate of the GW Urban Planning Program, but hopefully no one boos and hisses too aggressively here. We're all in it together. Yeah, I was invited. So one issue that's I've been following locally, and I think plays out across many cities that are just dealing with sort of infrastructure that's old is just specific to stormwater as just and looking at urban areas potentially receiving more precipitation. So without getting into too specifics, but broadly speaking, it seems like there's a tension between traditional gray infrastructure and designing to a very high and potentially redundant point, but with a high level of security that also has a distinct financial implication at a time when governments are barely maintaining infrastructure. So if I'm framing that properly, can you guys talk from your perspectives, engineering or policy or even science-wise, kind of the trade-off between green and gray infrastructure as it relates to first cost and ultimate performance in those peak times? So. Gray infrastructure would be like a big tunnel in the ground where you put the water. Green infrastructure being more like green roofs and a distributed, or seawall versus marshes. Is that maybe? Yeah.
So
Yeah,
Josh,
so-
why don't you start?
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful question. I very much appreciate it. It's a question on a lot of communities' minds these days, as they are, as you very accurately kind of portrayed in your question. They're looking at how they can not only manage stormwater now, but kind of thinking about these enormous capital investments that they're having to make into the future that are going to have to last 50, 100 years. I think that's one of the things that makes kind of thinking about and responding to climate change a challenge for communities is that a lot of people just dismiss it and think, we'll either figure out the situation by then or I won't be around, and so I don't have to think about it. But when you think about it in that respect, right, you're looking and engineering a solution now that you want to stand the test of time, and they can be very, very expensive. I mean, we see here in DC Water right now is digging this enormous stormwater retention tunnel under the city, this huge tunnel boring machine going from here all the way down to Blue Plains and Southeast, which is enormously expensive. And a lot of communities have a hard time selling the cost of that and how it's going to get paid for and how they pass that along to rate holders and what have you. So a lot of cities are looking into this idea of what we call green infrastructure, or also we refer to as natural nature-based features. And it's all predicated on this idea of what we call ecosystem services, or kind of leveraging the benefits that we as humans can receive from the natural landscape. That includes things like stormwater management. It's generally cheaper for a city to be able to implement that. However, that's kind of the $64,000 question these days, where there's a lot of research going into how we can quantify the benefits and be able to put that on par with some of the engineered structures, the gray infrastructure you speak of, in these benefit cost assessments that communities have to do as they're going through these giant capital expenditures. But we see some encouraging signs, whether it's stormwater management. flood attenuation. A great example is, and there are other different what we call co-benefits with regard to even temperature mitigation in our cities and our urban areas. We have the urban heat island effect. Philadelphia is looked as a great example of where they were faced with a daunting challenge to better manage their stormwater in the city, and they looked kind of be outside of the kind of gray infrastructure realm into green infrastructure, and how they could implement techniques that looked at the ability of certain pervious surfaces and certain natural features, trees and the like, to really help to retain groundwater, but also had many other recreational co-benefits and co-benefits that really, folks have just led to nothing more than a better sense of place in their communities. So it's strategies that NOAA and I know other federal agencies, Army Corps of Engineers, HUD, and others are really starting to leverage to work with communities to provide them with the information that they can use to really adequately assess whether or not it's a viable solution. And it does get down to, I think, your point on being able to adequately quantify how well these different landscapes are working to provide those benefits, and it's something we're definitely actively working on.
I have a question around risk management and how risk management has turned into a function that local governments are to deliver to their communities. So, Randy, you talked about how you've been in this before. The word resilience has become so popular. Can you talk a little bit about that process and the linkages between risk assessment and risk management and some of these larger ideas around long-term investment and how investment happens in communities?
And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that communities face. We live in a society today that's somewhat disposable, so we tend to use things up as far as we can before we buy new. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges local communities have right now is justifying that expense for the long term versus the needs of the short term. And I think that's where a lot of communities struggle economically is, I live in Syracuse, and our water infrastructure has deteriorated to the point that really not sure. The mayor's been to the governor, the mayor's been here in DC to talk to the president about trying to fix that infrastructure. And again, that's happens across the country because we've deferred for so long. So I think it's one of the biggest challenges local governments have is that deferment, that it's not going to be here when those folks who've come before us, it's not going to happen while I'm in office. We're paying the price of that now. So I think it's one of the biggest challenges local communities have is how do we address that risk long term when the issues we have immediately.
We have another question right here. Stand up and introduce yourself.
Hello, Ian Conyers. I'm in the Urban and Regional Planning Program. I wanted to ask a kind of an open question on how you've seen social media start to play a role in how people are interacting with the spaces across the city from a federal level, and particularly I was thinking of FEMA, but how it's playing a role in how folks are interacting.
I'm happy to start. A lot of different ways is the first answer. So everything from if you go over to the Red Cross, they have a digital operations center, and there are 2 screens set up, and one of those screens is dedicated to brand. Who's talking about the Red Cross? What are they saying about the Red Cross? Who are the big influencers in the discussions about the Red Cross brand? The other is operations. Where are there hazards occurring? What's the narrative happening in social media around those? And a great anecdote, they had a case where they saw a tweet from a babysitter in Oklahoma when there was a tornado warning, and she tweeted that she didn't know what to do, and the Red Cross was able to tweet her back and tell her what to do. And they refer to that kind of an exchange as a digital hug. And it was a marvelous illustration. At FEMA, not everybody wants a digital hug from FEMA, by the way. But at FEMA, right, we started seeing this both. I gave you the crowdsourcing situational awareness examples earlier, but also the flip side of that. During Sandy, we set up a dedicated team that for several weeks did nothing but put out corrected information, stamp out rumor in social media. And that turns out to be very important because some of those rumors were FEMA's out of water in New Jersey. No one's out of water in New Jersey. We have water. It's being distributed. Here's a picture of the truck and where it is and all the rest, so that you short circuit the misinformation and the corresponding effects that can have on that. So we've seen huge implications from that in a whole range of areas.
Comments on social media?
Well, just to quickly comment on the ARC, how much has changed. I mean, when I think about the aftermath of Katrina, I mean, one of the things that we needed to get in a week after the storm were cell phones. Like, that was a big effort. I would get volunteers to come in with as many cell phones as we could get, on loan or donated, to have a lifeline for the survivors to be able to reach out and sign up for FEMA and get on hold to register. So, I mean, I'm dating myself a little bit here, but the notion that now there's social media platforms at the community level to not only identify resources, but to provide this critical nexus of communicating what's available and what the urgent needs are it's pretty transformative how much has changed, or maybe how abysmal things were when we first tried to look at this social and communications infrastructure in places that had relatively limited access to cell phones or internet-based responses to even file initial FEMA claims. So I think we've come a long way, and I've seen a lot of good models emerge, particularly from Sandy, and some of that play out in how communities connected as part of the Rebuild by Design competition.
So I just want to confirm, though, so this is not just PR and damage control. You're suggesting that this is really becoming part of professional practice and how you do your job. Mm-hmm. Is that right? Yeah.
Can I just piggyback on one of your points for a sec, too, because I think that it's important to recognize the mobilization capability. You referenced it, but social media is enabling local collective action at a massive scale. That doesn't happen every time, and that's spontaneous and it's emergent, but it is enabling something qualitatively different in terms of scale than what we've seen before. And not all of that is good. During the London riots, the London police debated and had a hard time about the decision about whether to turn off BlackBerry Messenger, because they were every bit as dependent on it as the rioters who were using that system to organize the rioting. And so it presents all sorts of interesting challenges in a very concrete operational way as well. And I think that just bears mention given the larger discussion.
Thank you. This is interesting. I am also I teach in the urban planning and real estate program here at Georgetown. My name is Mina Marifat, and currently I'm teaching, and I'm here with all of my wonderful students, Global Cities by Design. And because resiliency is one of the major topics that we've covered, I am very interested in hearing what you have to say, but also to suggest, ask a question that is very much at the forefront of some of the things that we're studying, and that is the issue of innovation. There is a lot of very innovative and quite out-of-the-box thinking that is occurring not in one place, but all over the map, and ranging not in one subject, but all over the subject. Everything and anything that may be related to both social behavior, but also stewardship of the environment. I'm sure you're aware what Copenhagen is doing, amazing things about how to address the land use and to address the fact that they are one of the places that is, really dealing with the issue of coastal presence and the water table. You, I'm sure, are aware of what a young architect in New York is doing with oysters. I mean, oysters are an amazing creature. They can take water and totally purify it. one oyster can do 50 gallons in 24 hours. I mean, amazing stuff like that. There's a cactus. It's a naturally grown cactus, native to many, many parts of the world, where if you cut the piece of the cactus and throw it in, not so good water, after a while it can purify the water. You can actually drink water that has been purified by cactus. Who would have thought? So my question is, given that there is such a wide range of things, who and is there a way, I mean, we can use social media and all kinds of things, but there must be a way of harnessing the innovations and making it available to people. I have been actively seeking it out. So I know a whole bunch of these things that I know most people do not know. But how do we create the data bank of these kind of activities? I don't know if you know, Bhutan, the country of Bhutan as a nation is doing this. Why can't we learn from Bhutan and do a national policy that allows this information to be made available? Maybe it is our responsibility as teachers. Maybe it is a combination of federal and local and individual. But there must be a kind of harnessing of things. And let me bring some of the drawbacks of where we cannot do this. I in fact entered politics because I got so upset with the fact that our transportation department was actually paving an area that they should not have paved. They could have had pervious, we have water issues. Georgetown has a problem, and the whole area up to the cathedral has a problem with water. And they were redoing the asphalt with absolutely no regard. In fact, the few trees that were there were being removed. So the question is, why is the Department of Transportation doing that? When we know that we need more green, pervious surfaces, because groundwater is a very major issue in Washington. So the fact that one hand does not know what the other one is doing happens to be something that is very, very much part of the way we do things in America. So one, is there anybody at the level of the federal government or local government or regional governments thinking about somehow bringing policies together? We have changed our nation with policies. The highway policy single-handedly changed the face of the nation. Why can't we have another policy that changes the face of the nation for the better? I mean, the highways were good in many ways, but they had unforeseen circumstances.
Comments on the pace of change and how change happens locally?
Yeah, you raised some very interesting points. First and foremost, I think, within the federal government, we recognize that we ourselves are not going to be able to meet this challenge of helping communities become resilient by ourselves. I'd say that, post Katrina and post Sandy, that we have done a good job of kind of looking outside the proverbial box, there's the boundaries of this country. You see what HUD did and Secretary Donovan at the time and reaching out to the Netherlands. Here's a community that, as was stated earlier, has learned to live with the water, not to fight against it. And, if you've never heard Henk Ovink speak, who's a senior advisor to Secretary Donovan, he's fantastic in the way in which he really articulates that mindset that the Dutch have of respecting water. And so, I think very progressive, and I think seeing that, coming in and that, there are other good examples in the federal government where we're learning from others what others are doing. I'd also say that, academia plays an enormous role with that, with regard to what's out there in climate policies. In our own backyard here at Georgetown, we have the Georgetown Climate Center, which is a part of the law school that has a fantastic inventory of policies that have been enacted at the local level, the state level, the regional level. And I think, to your point, it's one of the best ways in which we can really make a difference from a federal level is to facilitate some of that knowledge transfer, not only from other countries to ourselves, but to where a community like King County in Seattle, which was one of the, on the forefront of really kind of, looking at climate change and its impacts in planning and integrating that into their planning, what's worked for them, how have they been able to meet that challenge head on, and how we can facilitate as federal agencies getting that information to another community to help them learn, and because we find that it's impactful for communities to learn from one another. Sometimes they listen to each other more than they'd like to listen to us as the federal government.
Yeah, I really think it comes from a dialogue of getting people to understand the similarities versus being told to or through policies and things like that. There's a school in Washington State for tsunami who they understand they cannot evacuate in time. They won't get enough notice, so they've gone to vertical evacuation. They have just enough time to move students to the roof of the building, and that's what their shelter is. But that's a unique situation for that particular school in that particular environment, and that's the dialogue that we have to have. And being from emergency management, we haven't done a good job in learning lessons either. I mean, our system has evolved over time to the system that we have today because we've made a lot of mistakes over the last 200 years. We tend not to learn those, and there tends to be gaps generationally. If you look at Hurricane Katrina, similar hurricanes had occurred in the past. It skipped a generation, and unfortunately we had to learn all those lessons over again, or we didn't learn those lessons over again, one or the other.
And I think for us, certainly the Dutch experience informed our response post-Sandy, but also opened the door to this international collaboration. With Rebuild by Design, it was a regional competition focused on one place in the Northeast, but the teams were represented 140 plus submissions from all over the world. And I think, what we tried to do was not just focus on the winning proposal or proposals, but take the best of what came through that competition as models that could serve really for us as a blueprint to do the long-term disaster planning and investments where I think it's a combination of policies where we're driving federal investments in a different way. And you brought up the example of oyster beds. That was one of the top proposals, was to take off the coast of Staten Island to create a living reef with oyster beds that could serve as breakwaters for future flood risks. So, we are trying to bring in, the ideas from leading thinkers and practitioners all over the world when we think about very localized long-term recovery plans. And our hope is that, what came out of that Rebuild by Design competition, that we can take those blueprints and share them so that they do become living documents or living reefs.
Good evening. My name is Granville Woodson. I'm a planning student here at Georgetown. My question is, and I hope I didn't miss it earlier before the discussion started, but as climate change and as the 100-year floodplain changes, how are organizations like NOAA, FEMA, and HUD, maybe up in the Boston area, they just had record snowstorms for 28 inches, and they're not used to that kind of water or flooding. How are your agencies, or how do agencies like that speak to each other to prepare for, even though it's an upcoming issue, but we know that we can't turn the clock back, so we know that there's going to be a future issue. Is there anything that you guys are doing currently right now to prepare for these new instances?
And let me just expand that question a little bit around this concept, not of, which has already been mentioned, not just of fixed known risks, but evolving risks over time, and the need to actually be in a predictive mode around future risks. Any comments on that?
So I'll start. One of the big areas of emphasis for FEMA right now is taking the work that was done with the federal flood risk management standard and using authorities that have been in place for quite some time to have presidentially set standards for how things will be rebuilt post-disaster and apply that authority in a way that allows us to build back to a privately insurable standard that allows FEMA. I keep saying us. It's only been 3 weeks. Give me a break. It'll be us for a while. But that's a really big difference from replacing the structure that previously existed, and then watching it wash out again and replace it again. And you can repeat that several times and not make any meaningful progress. But that idea that we recalibrate what it is that we are trying to get to, which is investing and reinvesting to a standard that is privately insurable, so the public money isn't brought back into it again, and to the point that was made earlier, that will endure over the lifespan of that facility. And we often do ourselves no favors in how we communicate about some of this. That the fact that we talk about a 100-year floodplain is not helpful, to put it mildly, right? Because most people interpret that as meaning if we had a 100-year event, we're good for 99 years. And that's not quite the same thing. But there are nevertheless really significant changes in how we're doing cost-benefit valuation, in how we're making policy decisions about standards to which things need to be rebuilt. Another good example is we won't rebuild schools in tornado-prone areas that don't have safe rooms anymore. Even though the safe room doesn't pass the cost-benefit threshold, we've stopped making that an economic calculation, and we started making that a policy calculation around the fact that it's unconscionable to rebuild a school in an area that school has been wiped out because of tornado risk, where there is not a room for children to gather where they will be safe from a future event.
I'd say that, our kind of MO with the federal government is that we're hopelessly stovepiped. At least I used to think that we all kind of worked in our own kind of federal agencies. But I've been very impressed, post Sandy, in this whole kind of idea of really working more collaboratively to how we can, start to enhance community resilience. I think we're working together more than we ever have. And there are various examples as to where NOAA is working collaboratively with FEMA, with HUD, with the Army Corps of Engineers, with Department of Defense and other agencies, DHS, we're at large. I think it's because we all recognize that in order to meet this challenge of helping communities to become more resilient, because we spoke about the fact that it's a very multidimensional problem, right? That no one agency is going to have the capabilities to be able to provide information on climate risks. And there's NOAA supports the Global Change Research Program, is a fantastic research collaborative in the federal government to help provide information not only on risk, but also, as Dave spoke about earlier, uncertainty. And a lot of us aren't very comfortable with, a lot of folks don't understand, if there's a 40% chance of rain and it rains in your area, you think that the forecast was a total miss. Well, it's a misunderstanding of kind of probabilities and certainty and confidence and uncertainty. And so it's a challenge that I think all of us recognize that we can leverage the collective capabilities of all of our agencies and organizations to be able to provide that support to communities, to get them the information, and then to provide the policies that we all have through our various mandates collectively to allow them to not only say, okay, we understand the risks, we understand our vulnerabilities, we get it, what can we do? And so that's where, an agency like NOAA may not have as strong a role as, say, HUD, which has, instruments, policy instruments and funding like the Community Development Block Grant Program that, that potentially could be useful in helping communities actually, to address their risks and ultimately become more resilient. So, for us, I think I've been very impressed and very hopeful. And I think that resilience is really going to be a topic that's going to help us as federal agencies and organizations do a better job of working collaboratively in the future.
I'm Julius Jackson from the National Institute of Emergency Medical Services here in D.C. I have a comment. You talk about dating yourself. It occurs to me that 10 years ago, I was a newly minted sergeant in the National Guard on the ground in Katrina. So I don't mind dating myself. Because it will help inform the policy decisions and making policy easier for people in government, what can we do to awaken our population better as other generations were, where people understand that things will go bump in the day and the night, and that it's more than emergency responders who need to be able to understand and do things, but also so that it allows our government to be proactive and not just reactive as it is stuck doing sort of at the present time?
I think it's a great question, really about deep community resilience and not just reactions.
Well, I think of places like Israel and other countries that have massive disaster type scenarios on a more regular basis than we do, where everybody gets it, so the government is allowed to do what they must to be ready.
So, just a quick point. I think part of this is the funds tend to be appropriated after the disaster, right? So the 40 billion I referenced, that we would love to have, smaller annual allocations that would give us a chance to put that money into future investments, exactly to your point. But we're both, and the competition will enable us to do that with the 1 billion, to look back, for areas that were federally declared disasters over, a 3-year time span. That's the community that we're trying to reach. But the notion of doing this forward-looking resilience competition is to utilize rare federal dollars to seed the work that's going to help the first responders, the policymakers, and the local community plan for long-term resilience. And it's hard, I think, in the way that we deal with appropriations to find a balance between the two. So the point is well taken, and I think we're just starting to crack the door open to do just that.
But I think what's different is, you mentioned before, we learned our lessons in the past, but I think it's a different paradigm today. The fact that what Dave was talking about earlier, since President Obama's administration has been in office, more people live in urban centers. We don't have the people who've lived in communities for several generations, and we can rely on those older generations to talk to us and tell us how to prepare. We don't have to tweet the Red Cross to find out what to do in a tornado. I lived through my grandfather or my father's experience about a tornado, and I know what to do. Because I've lived through it myself as a child, let's say. We have to change the way that we look at we approach the public and manage expectations and understand that this dynamic is different, that people move to more metropolitan areas. How do we engage them as city leaders and urban leaders? Coming up with new ways. That old way of doing it just won't work. So it's another challenge. Capturing the lessons learned and all the good things that people are doing is one thing. And the other thing is socially, how do we engage the public and what's the tie to their new community that they're part of?
So I think you touch on a really important point that we haven't really talked about yet, which is, so it's a little esoteric, but resilience is in the eye of the beholder. It's like prosperity. We can all agree we like it, but none of us will define it the same way. And in there lies the secret to it, right? Which is that it's got to be rooted and grounded in local context, local values, local priorities. The more that achieving resilience, if you will, is another thing that has to happen, the less effective we will be at it. The real power of the concept is an integrative one. We have most of the tools already in place. They are just not connected and aligned with one another. This is true at local level. We have economic development planning. We have social service delivery. We have lots of work streams from lots of different government and non-government organizations around poverty and education and safety. I mean, the list goes on. We have lots of people mobilized every day on an everyday basis. We have master planning. We may or may not have codes and standards. That's a separate discussion. There are some states that don't have building codes. So, but most of those tool sets are already there. They are just not linked. And so there isn't a mandate or a requirement for an integrative theme there whereby you're looking for, as we achieve progress in dealing with poverty, we have an ancillary benefit over here. And so thinking about these issues not as an either or, but as a spectrum, and looking for the positive externalities from our actions, looking for the secondary benefits in other areas is really important. The other thing I would say is we are, I think personally, witnessing a real shift in the nature of public administration, and we're early into it, but the public's expectation of voice is changing. There is a greater expectation of voice, of consultation, of ability to provide input into all sorts of issues. And so in a sense, sort of the spirit of
Participatory.
thank you, that one, participatory democracy, participatory governance really is the hope for many of these issues. And I find that sort of hopeful because that also is the founding principles of our nation. So there's, in a poorly worded sum up, I feel like Elmer Fudd up here.
That's great. Of course, now we're closing and everybody has questions. Okay, quickly, please. We're going to do a lightning round here.
Sorry, lightning round.
Very quick question.
My name is Lieutenant Commander Adam Samuels. I'm not a student here. I'm obviously in the Navy, but I work at the Defense Threat Reduction Agency's Cooperative Biological Engagement Program, which has nothing to do with my question, though. My question is, what are some of the trends, perhaps, that you've seen in resiliency, not just here in the United States, but maybe internationally, which it's like, wow, that's a really good lessons learned that we could apply here. Perhaps related to the fact that we have more and more people moving into cities and we can't evacuate the cities the way we did before, or there are more, with climate change, there's more incidents of flooding or fire or roof collapse or major disasters at a more frequent basis. So what are some trends that perhaps you've seen that aren't being addressed yet in the United States, but while Belgium or Israel or Japan or India is really a leader in this innovative way of doing things? Thank you.
Great question. Well, we heard about the Dutch example already. Copenhagen was mentioned.
I think World Bank has just released a report this year about resiliency, and I think the Canadians scored very well on a number of issues. Toronto, I think, was the number one. I think Vancouver was the number two city as far as in the way that they looked at it. So I think there's a lot we can learn from the Canadians. There's examples all across the world, but again, it's individually based. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I would say one of the things that I did in office was co-create what became a 10-country policy community, looking specifically at issues of community resilience. And the dominant policy themes that were there were really around issues surrounding emergent leadership, the nature of the relationship between government and the public, and governance in those contexts. And we tend to forget that people's experience with government isn't issue specific, it's in total. So, we show up, we're here from FEMA, we're here to help, or we want your attention on preparedness. Well, who's talking to me and taking care of my kids while the gangs are trying to recruit my child on the way to school every day? Talk to me about that first, and then talk to me about your issue. And we forget that sort of totality view. And I think we saw that very strongly, that sort of there's a need to recognize the terms on which the relationship between the state and civil society is occurring, and to navigate from the real point that exists now, which is very localized, out. And in the case of crisis, to recognize that there'll be spontaneous action and emergent leadership, and sometimes that will come from sources you can predict, and a lot of the times it'll come from somewhere you didn't see coming. And that's a real challenge to government in terms of how do you react to that? Is it okay to work with Occupy Sandy or not? If it's okay to work with them, how do we work with them? Just to take the US example. But I gave you that example. We could talk about the Mud Army in Brisbane, Australia, the Student Army in Christchurch, other cases where tens of thousands of people have spontaneously mobilized in response to a crisis. And those are not, those happen on more frequency than we often think.
Thank you. Kristin Plasner, I work for Deloitte Sustainability Denmark. I'm from Copenhagen, so I very much appreciate all the comments on that. There's a lot I took for granted, which I maybe shouldn't. But back to the innovation part, I think actually a lot of the innovation in Copenhagen that has been going on is because the barriers between the public and the private sector are a little bit more fluent, or there's a lot of learning crossing both ways. Also, I work with enterprises who try to mitigate risk and work sustainable. So you mentioned how you all work together, how you work with the communities, but could you address how you see the role of enterprises, of the corporate sector, and how you work on transcending those barriers, and what is stick, what is carrot, what do you think needs to be done in that regard?
I'm happy to keep talking. I'll keep looking at it.
I guess maybe I could just real quickly, one area in particular where I see not only NOAA but other federal agencies working with private enterprise is in the insurance community. If we think about, being exposed to risk, and who's the most exposed, it's going to be the insurers. And worldwide, they're very attuned to risk, and they're obviously concerned. They've got, enormous investments in areas of very high risk. And so I see a lot of good opportunities and lots of momentum coming forth through the leadership from the White House and the President's Climate Action Plan, looking at how we can work collaboratively with the insurance community to both learn lessons as to how they kind of view and how they're the risk experts, essentially. And then how we can kind of work collaboratively to provide data and information that can allow communities to leverage the same methods and information that the insurers have to better understand and communicate risk. So I see that's a good potential example there.
So I think another aspect that kind of relates to the Climate Action Plan and administrative initiative is around Build America and this focus on reinvestment in infrastructure. The panel describe some of the deferred maintenance issues we have to reconcile with yet this added layer of thinking about redundant systems or a deeper level of investment. Even if the savings materialize later, there's still the question of its initial cost of capital to do investments or reinvestments that we haven't tackled and have been underfunded for some time. So there's a key piece for all different enterprises, but I'd say there's this mission-related and social impact investment capital that we see coming in potentially to fill some of those gaps in the near term, and are doing some pretty pioneering work around green infrastructure. We're looking at it through the lens of investing in energy-efficient retrofits and affordable housing, where we know that there's a potential for a 20% energy savings to pay back the upfront investment, but there isn't a flow of new investment dollars coming into these markets. So I think it's a great question, and there's this critical gap, be it built environment in the housing space around energy improvements or social infrastructure in communities. I think that the public-private partnership piece to that is very much where we're looking to grow this practice.
It's a great question. I think we've made a lot of headway in the operational space, learning to work cooperatively with private industry in meaningful ways, coordinating FEMA's logistics movements with big box stores, making sure that we are understanding their projections of what stores will be open or closed, factoring that into our own staging in advance of a crisis. But the deeper challenges that we're dealing with are really around figuring out the interface in the ways that you were just talking about. And there's a lot of work to do there. There's a new initiative that the UN has sponsored with some private companies called RISE. It's R!SE, if you look it up. And I think if you just glance through the program summary of that, you'll see in a whole range of areas the case that's being made for how to figure out pricing signals for long-term risks, how those get woven into capital investment decisions, most of which are private, how you figure out the risk metrics piece of that and where that plays. There's real challenges to be worked out in this space as well. And the only way we really change the trend lines from what we're experiencing are going to be cracking it there, really starting to change how we build and invest the first time. And so I think it's a really important question.
We have one last very short question, and then Nancy, maybe you can make some closing observations, and then we have a reception that's all set up and waiting for us upstairs.
Okay. Hello, my name is Nora. I'm in the urban planning program. Thank you for these insights tonight. I appreciated the mention just now of capital investments prior to and subsequent to emergencies. I have this image of the post-Katrina coastline of the Gulf, of McDonald's and mansions and trailers just driving along. And it's an interesting image because it depicts in a very real way the first actors to emerge onto the real estate scene post-disaster. And I saw people desperate for homes and opportunistically being very likely exploited in wake of disasters. And so I was wondering if you could even quickly sketch out some either preventative measures to ensure that vulnerable populations do not fall prey to this kind of exploitation in real estate after disasters, or hopes that you have for resolution of that kind of circumstance. Thank you.
Really short question.
Yeah.
I love that question.
That's a terrific question, and I have, and in my memory, a similar image with also the what was left of the foundations of the homes, be it just a few steps from one of my former law colleagues' office to the outline of homes that had been washed away in the 20 to 30 foot tidal surge. So it's the way you described it to me, though, was also what it looked like before the storm, too, from a planning perspective of just, this coastline that has this incredible mix of commercial and residential growth that is felt idiosyncratic coming from another region, to see how planning and development had occurred on coastal Mississippi, and then you referenced the predatory nature of real estate investments after the storm. How we protect that, and it's supposed to be the lightning round, so maybe we can talk at the reception. And I want to get to the reception because what keeps me up at night is my new baby at home, so I'm happy to be out of the house tonight. But the protecting the community's assets, and also I think from my experience in Katrina was trying to find a way to help in the short to medium term, so that families didn't feel like they had to make a desperate choice. And that was everything from figuring out, how some of the SBA loan practices work to enable a flow of capital back into these communities, to things like, this was a shock to me that so much of the land that some of my clients, when I was at the Lawyers Committee, there wasn't clear property title to their land, which makes them even more vulnerable to preserving a housing asset and being able to even access FEMA dollars or other housing recovery dollars. So I think there's not I don't have a quick answer to a very insightful question, but I do see a lot of lessons learned in terms of protecting communities in place, and being able to provide that initial lifeline to resources, and in a more deliberative way, some options to provide alternative housing, be temporary in nature, or new assets to come in to help low-income communities reinvest in the places that they live and work.
So this will be really easy to sum up. So I kind of, maybe three main topics that I think came out in this, and maybe think about how they might be affecting the way things have been, and also the way things are changing. We first talked about social media and the way we live with technology and how we live in the present now. So a lot of decisions are made because they're conscious of the timeline. From the time I do or don't make this decision, what's going to be in the press, what's going to be on CNN, what's going to be on Twitter. We also talked about risk and consequence, and how difficult it is with some of the problems that we're facing today, with respect to understanding and having a common agreement on what is the probability of certain events occurring. The issue around climate change has become, almost religious about is it or isn't it. The issue of the 100-year floodplain means there's only a flood that's going to happen every 100 years. We see how people react in their environments and their perception of risk. If you've lived on the coast of Texas or Florida and seen hurricanes come year after year, and what that means is, woohoo, get out the surfboards, hurricane party. You just think it's not going to happen to you. And we kind of live in that environment now. And then we talked a lot about innovation. And a lot of the innovation was kind of point solutions. They're doing this here and this works really well. And so I'll go back to where I started with technology. There's a lot of really great technologies out there, but they have to work in the environment and the culture in which you're using them. And so many of these things that we're doing, we haven't yet figured out the system and how the whole system fits together. Green roofs and electric cars and all those kinds of things. How do we start thinking about if you've got a garage where you've got a bunch of batteries in that garage that are plugged in every day, all day, actually feeding back to the grid when they're needed, instead of just drawing from the grid. And I think these are some really tough problems that we're going to be facing, and we are facing, and we are making great strides, and I hope that they will continue to be great strides at a faster pace. So thank you for being here. Thank you for your great questions, and I hope we'll have more of this conversation when we break for the reception.
Let's join us. Thank our panelists. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you to our panelists.